I did buy them to own them, but to set them free. The rancher who broke the chains. The town sat on the edge of wide plains and rolling hills, with the kind of open skies that stretched so far you could almost touch the clouds if you reached high enough. John's family had lived there for generations, working a modest ranch that his grandfather had started many years ago. Life on the ranch was simple but not easy. From the moment John could walk, he was expected to help, feeding the animals, mending fences, hauling water, and learning the ways of ranch life. Most children might have complained about the work, but John felt a quiet joy in it. There was something comforting in the rhythm of daily chores, the smell of hay, the warmth of the sun on his back, and the sound of animals moving around him. Even as a young boy, John noticed the animals around him in ways others often ignored. While his friends would run off to play ball or climb trees, he would linger near the edge of the pasture, watching the horses that roamed freely across the hills. Their manes flew in the wind, and their hooves kicked up dust that glittered in the sunlight. John didn't just see them as animals. He felt their spirit, their desire to move without boundaries, to feel the world beneath them, and to run simply for the joy of it. It was in those moments that he first began to dream about freedom, not just for the animals, but for every living being that suffered quietly in the background of human life. John's parents were practical people. They loved their land and their animals, but they also understood the value of work and money. His father often spoke about responsibility, about making the ranch profitable, and about the hard realities of the world. Animals can feed us, they can help us, but we have to treat life with sense, his father would say. To most children, those words might have seemed strict or limiting, but John didn't mind. He respected his father, yet in the quiet corners of his mind, he questioned the ways the world measured worth. He began to notice not just the free horses, but also the animals in pens, tied or caged, that had no choice over their lives. Chickens cooped up in small wire cages, calves separated from their mothers, horses in stables with barely enough space to move. They were alive, yet their spirits were restrained. The more John saw, the more it troubled him. School offered little escape, but it did open new doors for John's curiosity. He loved reading stories about animals and nature, about faraway lands and people who cared deeply for creatures that had no voice. He read about wildlife conservation, about rescuers who risked everything to save endangered animals, and about people who dedicated their lives to protection rather than profit. Each story added fuel to a small fire growing in John's heart. He began to imagine a life where he could combine the skills he learned on the ranch with this sense of purpose, where his love for animals could become something more than a personal joy. It could become a mission. But childhood dreams rarely come without challenge. In a town like John's, deviation from tradition was often met with skepticism or even ridicule. His friends teased him for spending hours sitting by the fence, watching a single horse graze. "Why don't you play with us?" they would ask, not understanding that John's play was the freedom of watching life in motion. Some neighbors shook their heads at his gentle treatment of animals, insisting that animals needed discipline, that they existed to work or serve. And yet John didn't let their opinions dim his spirit. Instead, he learned to see the world in two ways. One was the reality of everyday life, necessary and practical, and the other was a vision of how life could be kinder, gentler, freer. As he grew older, John began experimenting quietly. He started with small acts, leaving extra food for stray animals, building small shelters for injured birds, and gently nursing sick animals back to health. He found that the more care he gave, the more the animals seemed to respond. There was a subtle understanding in their eyes, a trust that developed slowly but unmistakably. John began to realize that freedom wasn't just a physical state, it was something deeper. It was a sense of safety, of being seen and valued. And it was in these quiet moments, caring for a wounded rabbit or coaxing a frightened foal to stand, that John felt a profound connection to life itself. By the time he reached his teenage years, John's compassion had grown into a quiet determination. He began to notice patterns around him, the way some animals were sold for quick profit, how others were abandoned when they no longer served a purpose, and how human indifference often caused more harm than outright cruelty. He started keeping notes, sketching plans for a place where animals could be safe, healthy, and free. These sketches weren't just drawings, they were a vision for a different kind of ranch. One that balanced the traditions he had inherited with the compassion he felt in his heart. One that did not see animals merely as property, but as beings with lives of their own. Of course, dreams alone were not enough. John understood the practicalities of ranch life. He studied how to care for animals properly, learning about nutrition, veterinary care, and breeding practices, not for profit, but for health and well-being. He sought advice from older ranchers, sometimes enduring their criticism, and from wildlife experts, absorbing their knowledge eagerly. He even experimented with ways to provide large open spaces, where animals could roam safely without risking injury or escape. Every small improvement became a lesson, and every lesson brought him closer to the vision that had been forming in his mind since childhood. Even as John prepared for adulthood, he remained acutely aware of the tension between the world as it was and the world as he wished it could be. He knew that owning a ranch did not automatically grant the freedom he dreamed of for the animals. Property laws, neighbors, and financial constraints all imposed limits, but rather than discourage him, these realities sharpened his resolve. John began to see obstacles not as barriers, but as challenges to overcome. If the world insisted on chains, he would find ways to loosen them. If animals were confined by circumstance, he would create opportunities for freedom. And if people doubted his intentions, he would prove them wrong through action, not words. By the time he inherited the family ranch, John was ready. He carried the lessons of his childhood with him, the patience learned from sitting quietly with animals, the understanding that freedom meant more than a physical space, and the unwavering belief that one person could make a difference if they acted with heart. He understood that the journey ahead would be difficult, full of critics, setbacks, and unexpected challenges, but he also knew that it was a journey worth taking. For John, the ranch was no longer just land passed down through generations. It had become a canvas for change, a place where compassion could be cultivated, and where the quiet power of kindness could reshape lives, both human and animal. Even now, when he looked across the rolling hills of his ranch, watching a wild horse gallop freely against the horizon, John felt a surge of hope. That same feeling had accompanied him since he was a boy, the belief that freedom, love, and understanding could exist even in a world often harsh and unforgiving. It was a belief that would guide every decision he made, every life he touched, and every chain he hoped to break. John's early life had taught him many things: resilience, patience, responsibility, and the value of hard work. But most importantly, it had taught him empathy, the ability to see beyond appearances and understand the inner world of another living being. This empathy, cultivated over years of quiet observation and small acts of kindness, would become the cornerstone of his life's mission. And so, with the inheritance of the family ranch came not only property but purpose. John Miller was ready to step into a world where ownership did not mean control, where compassion could overcome tradition, and where the simple act of setting an animal free could change everything. When John officially took over the family ranch, he felt a mix of excitement and responsibility. The land had been in his family for generations, and he knew the value of every fence, every pasture, and every barn. Yet, for John, the ranch was no longer just a source of livelihood. It was a place where he could make a real difference in the lives of the animals he cared for so deeply. From the very beginning, he had a plan, not a plan to make the ranch wealthier, but a plan to transform it into a sanctuary where creatures could heal, grow, and most importantly, experience freedom. John's first step was small but deliberate. He started by buying animals that others considered worthless or unwanted. These were creatures abandoned by their owners, animals that had been injured, or ones that were being sold for slaughter. Some people in the town shook their heads when they heard about John's choices. "Why spend money on them? You can't sell them. They won't make you any profit," they said. Others whispered that he had gone soft, that he had forgotten the purpose of a ranch. But John ignored the doubts and focused on the task ahead. To him, it wasn't about money or ownership. It was about giving a chance at life to those who had none. The first animals he rescued were a group of horses from a nearby farm. They had been neglected, living in cramped stalls without proper food or medical care. When John saw them for the first time, he felt a mixture of sadness and determination. Their eyes were weary, and their bodies bore the marks of hardship, yet there was still a spark of spirit in them. John knew that if he could nurse them back to health, he could give them a life they had never known, a life of freedom. Back on his ranch, John began the process of rehabilitation. It was not easy. Some of the horses were scared of humans, flinching at every movement. Others were weak and sick, needing constant attention. John spent long hours with them, speaking softly, feeding them by hand, and gently encouraging them to trust him. He learned quickly that patience was the key. The animals could sense his intentions, and the more calm and consistent he was, the more they began to respond. Slowly, they started to regain their strength, their confidence, and in some small ways their joy. Word of John's efforts began to spread. At first, it was just whispers among neighbors and fellow ranchers. "Have you seen what John is doing?" some asked. "He bought those horses not to work them, but just to take care of them." Some people admired his dedication, but others remained skeptical. Many still believed that animals were property, tools to be used, and that John's compassion was a waste of time. The skepticism did not bother John. He knew that real change often required courage, and he was ready to face the challenges ahead. As he continued, John realized that rescuing animals required more than compassion. It required resources, knowledge, and careful planning. He had to learn about veterinary care, nutrition, and safe handling techniques. He studied books, attended workshops, and reached out to experienced animal rescuers for advice. He discovered the importance of proper fencing, how to prevent injuries, and ways to give animals space to exercise and express natural behaviors. Each lesson he learned made him more confident and more capable. With every improvement he made on the ranch, the animals began to thrive. John's vision expanded beyond horses. He began rescuing goats, pigs, and even birds that had been abandoned or mistreated. Each species brought its own challenges, but John welcomed them all. He learned how to feed them properly, how to provide shelters that mimicked their natural environments, and how to create routines that would help them feel safe. The ranch slowly transformed into a living sanctuary, a place where animals could heal physically and emotionally. Volunteers began to join him, inspired by his dedication and by the remarkable changes they saw in the animals. Despite these successes, John faced setbacks that tested his resolve. Some animals were too injured to recover fully, and others had been so traumatized that trust was difficult to rebuild. There were days when John felt frustrated, exhausted, and even defeated. He had invested time, energy, and love into creatures who sometimes did not respond the way he hoped. Yet, every small victory, a horse grazing confidently in the pasture, a goat nuzzling a hand, a bird learning to fly again, reminded him why he persisted. Each success, no matter how small, was a step toward his ultimate goal, freedom for the animals he had saved. Financial challenges also loomed. Running a sanctuary was expensive, and John had to balance the costs of food, medical care, and infrastructure with the reality that the animals could not generate income. He learned to be creative, finding ways to reduce costs without compromising care. He started small fundraising efforts, reached out to friends and family, and eventually gained attention from local media. Stories about the ranch, the rescued animals, and John's mission began to inspire others. People from nearby towns visited to see the sanctuary, volunteers offered their time, and donations started to help cover the expenses. What had begun as a quiet, personal mission gradually became a community effort, though John never lost sight of the animals themselves. John also faced criticism from those who believed that wild animals should never be kept on a ranch, even temporarily. Some argued that he was interfering with nature, that animals were meant to be wild or used for work. John listened to these concerns carefully. He respected the opinions of others, but also knew that compassion required action. He made sure that, when possible, animals were returned to environments where they could live safely and freely. For those who could not survive in the wild, the ranch became their permanent sanctuary. John's guiding principle was simple. He did not buy animals to own them, but to give them a chance at a life they deserved. As months turned into years, the ranch became a place of hope. The animals that arrived weak, frightened, and wary of humans gradually transformed into healthy, confident creatures. Volunteers who came to help were often inspired by what they saw. They learned from John's example that patience, kindness, and respect could overcome fear and trauma. Children who visited the ranch learned that animals were not just property or tools. They were living beings with emotions and needs. The ranch became a quiet classroom for compassion, showing that even small acts of care could ripple outward and make a significant difference. One of the most remarkable changes John noticed was in himself. The daily work, the quiet observation, and the constant problem-solving strengthened his character and deepened his empathy. He had always cared for animals, but now he understood the profound responsibility that came with it. He learned to be patient in ways he had never imagined, to trust the process even when immediate results were not visible, and to celebrate small victories as much as large ones. John realized that saving animals was not just about physical care. It was about understanding their emotions, their fears, and their desires. By this time, John's reputation had grown beyond his small town. He began receiving letters and calls from people in other areas who wanted advice, who wanted to donate, or who simply wanted to thank him for his dedication. While he appreciated the recognition, John remained focused on the animals. Each horse, goat, pig, or bird that arrived at the ranch was treated with the same care and attention as the first ones he had rescued. He understood that each life was unique, and that freedom, trust, and safety could not be rushed or measured in profit. John's story during this period was not just about rescuing animals. It was about challenging assumptions, changing hearts, and showing that one person could make a difference. Through every obstacle, every skeptical comment, and every difficult day, he demonstrated that compassion was stronger than cynicism, and love more powerful than fear. He proved that a ranch could be more than a business. It could be a sanctuary, a place of healing, and a symbol of hope for both animals and humans alike. By the end of these early years, John had accomplished something extraordinary. His ranch was no longer just land. It was a living, breathing testament to what one person's determination and compassion could achieve. The animals that arrived timid, sick, or neglected were now thriving, some returning to the wild, others living happily on the ranch. Volunteers and community members had been inspired to join him, creating a ripple effect of kindness that extended far beyond the property. John had not only saved lives but had also nurtured a culture of care, teaching everyone around him that freedom, respect, and love were worth every effort. John Miller's journey in these early years showed that real change comes slowly, through patience, persistence, and unwavering belief in what is right. It was a journey that required courage, empathy, and hard work, but it also offered rewards that money could never buy. The sight of an animal running freely for the first time, the trust in a once frightened eye, and the knowledge that life could be transformed through compassion. And as John looked out over his ranch at the end of each day, watching the animals he had saved moving, playing, and resting in peace, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. As John's sanctuary grew, he realized that rescuing animals was only the beginning. The real challenge lay in the obstacles that came with this mission, both natural and human. While his early successes had been rewarding, the road ahead proved far more complicated than he had anticipated. He had envisioned a ranch where animals could be free and safe, but the reality was that freedom did not come easily. Animals were fragile, circumstances were unpredictable, and people's opinions could be harsh and unforgiving. The first major challenge came in the form of a severe storm. One night, dark clouds gathered over the hills, and rain poured down with a force that turned pastures into muddy rivers. Fences, carefully built to protect the animals, were damaged, and some of the younger horses became trapped in the rising water. John barely slept, running from one end of the ranch to the other, checking on every creature. He waded through mud, climbed over fallen fences, and pulled frightened animals to safety. By the morning, the ranch was a mess, fences broken, shelters damaged, and some animals injured. But through it all, John refused to give in to despair. He spent days repairing damage, tending to wounds, and reassuring the animals with a calm, steady presence. The experience taught him an important lesson. True compassion required resilience and a readiness to face unexpected trials. While storms tested John's resolve, human resistance tested his patience. Some local ranchers and town officials began questioning his methods. They argued that John was interfering with tradition, that wild animals should be left alone, or that domestic animals were meant to work, not roam freely. Occasionally, visitors came to the ranch and criticized his care practices, claiming that animals needed stricter control or more confinement. It was difficult at first not to take these words personally. John cared deeply for the creatures under his watch, and it pained him to hear others dismiss his efforts as foolish or naive. Yet, over time, he learned to listen carefully, separate criticism from advice, and focus on the mission rather than the opinions of skeptics. The financial pressures of running a sanctuary also intensified. Feeding dozens of animals, providing medical care, repairing facilities, and maintaining the property required money that was not easy to come by. John had savings from the family ranch, but expenses quickly mounted. He began to organize small community fundraisers, appealing to the generosity of friends, family, and neighbors. Local schools invited him to speak about animal care and rescue, and slowly, donations and volunteer support began to trickle in. These small acts of generosity helped sustain the ranch, but John knew that long-term stability would require even more effort, creativity, and planning. Among the human and financial challenges, John faced one of the most heartbreaking struggles, helping animals overcome trauma. Many of the creatures he rescued had been mistreated, neglected, or abandoned. Some horses flinched at the slightest touch, while others refused to eat or interact with humans. Pigs that had been confined in small pens refused to move freely, and goats that had been isolated were terrified of other animals. John realized that freedom was not something that could be given instantly. It had to be earned through trust, patience, and care. Each animal had its own pace, and forcing progress only caused setbacks. John spent countless hours observing, learning, and adapting to the needs of each creature. He discovered that understanding an animal's fears and working slowly to alleviate them was often more effective than any physical intervention. The emotional toll of this work was heavy. John loved the animals he rescued, but he also had to confront loss. Some animals were too sick or injured to survive despite his best efforts. Others were deeply traumatized, and no amount of care could fully heal their fear. Each loss weighed heavily on John, and there were nights when he questioned whether his mission was worth the pain. Yet even in the darkest moments, he found motivation in the animals who did recover, in the moments when a horse ran freely for the first time, or when a frightened goat finally approached him with trust. These victories, however small, reminded him why he persevered. One of the most significant challenges came in the form of a horse named Shadow. Shadow had been abandoned as a foal and had endured months of neglect before John found him. He was emaciated, covered in scars, and terrified of human contact. Every attempt to approach him was met with a defensive kick or a panicked dash across the pasture. John knew that healing Shadow would require immense patience. For weeks, he visited Shadow daily, speaking softly and leaving food in his presence without forcing interaction. Slowly, Shadow began to accept John's presence inch by inch. Eventually, the horse allowed John to touch him, then to lead him by a halter, and finally to run freely in the pasture with other horses. Shadow's transformation was a powerful lesson for John. Trust and freedom could not be rushed, but they could flourish with consistency, patience, and genuine care. In addition to trauma, John also had to manage conflicts among animals. Not all rescues integrated smoothly. Some animals were aggressive, territorial, or simply unwilling to coexist. John had to learn how to observe their behavior, separate them when necessary, and create environments where each animal could feel secure. This required ingenuity and careful planning. Fences, separate pastures, shelters, and enrichment activities all played a role in ensuring harmony. John learned to balance the needs of each animal while maintaining the vision of a safe, open, and free environment. Over time, John also realized that education was part of his mission. Many visitors came to the ranch curious about his work. He explained that freedom was not just a physical state, it was emotional and mental as well. Animals needed space to express natural behaviors, safety to recover from fear, and patience from humans to build trust. John encouraged volunteers and visitors to observe quietly, to avoid forcing interactions, and to appreciate the slow, steady progress that characterized true rehabilitation. Through these lessons, John hoped to inspire a broader understanding of animal care and respect in his community. Despite all the difficulties, the ranch began to thrive. Animals that had been sick, abandoned, or frightened grew strong and healthy. Horses galloped across open fields, pigs explored wide pastures, goats climbed safely on structures that simulated natural terrain, and birds learned to fly in secure areas. Volunteers witnessed these transformations daily, often overwhelmed by the dramatic changes in animals that had seemed hopeless when they first arrived. For John, every recovery reinforced his belief that compassion, dedication, and patience could overcome even the most difficult obstacles. John's approach was unconventional, but it was effective. While many ranchers focused on production and profit, he focused on care and freedom. People who once doubted him began to take notice. Some neighbors came to respect his methods, even if they did not fully understand them. Local journalists wrote articles highlighting his sanctuary, praising his dedication and innovative practices. The community gradually came to see that John's work was not only valuable for animals, but also for people, teaching empathy, responsibility, and the importance of kindness in daily life. Through these trials, John also grew personally. He learned resilience, problem-solving, and the importance of staying calm under pressure. He discovered the satisfaction that comes from quiet, steady work, and the rewards of long-term dedication. He learned that challenges, no matter how daunting, could be overcome with patience, preparation, and unwavering commitment. And he realized that the struggles he faced were not obstacles to success, but essential parts of the journey, lessons that shaped him into a better caretaker, a wiser thinker, and a stronger person. By the end of this challenging period, John had established a sanctuary that was more than just a ranch, it was a haven. Animals who had known fear, pain, and neglect now experienced care, freedom, and hope. Volunteers and visitors carried the lessons they learned from John into their own lives, spreading understanding and compassion beyond the borders of the ranch. John had faced storms, criticism, financial pressures, and emotional heartbreak, yet he emerged stronger and more determined than ever. His work had become a living example of how dedication and empathy could transform lives, creating a ripple effect of kindness in a world that often seemed indifferent. John's journey in these years proved that freedom was not given lightly. It had to be earned through patience, understanding, and courage. It was not always easy, and the challenges were many, but each obstacle strengthened his mission. John Miller had learned that the most meaningful victories were those that required effort, care, and unwavering commitment. And as he looked across his ranch at the animals thriving under his care, he knew that the difficult path he had chosen was exactly where he was meant to be, guiding, protecting, and setting free those who could not speak for themselves. As the years went by, John Miller began to notice a change, not just in the animals he cared for, but in himself, in his community, and in the way people saw the world around him. The ranch, which had started as a quiet place for rescue and recovery, had grown into something far greater than he ever imagined. It had become a sanctuary not only for animals, but for lessons in compassion, patience, and understanding. Every creature that walked, ran, or flew across his land carried a story of resilience and hope, and John felt the weight and honor of guiding them through their journeys. The animals continued to arrive, each with their own challenges. Some were older horses who had been overworked and neglected, their bodies bent from years of strain. Others were young, frightened animals who had never known kindness. Each one required careful attention, a gentle hand, and an unwavering commitment to their well-being. John had learned over the years that rushing the process led to setbacks. Healing, whether physical or emotional, required patience. He observed their behaviors closely, noticing the smallest signs of progress. A tremor replaced by steady steps, a flinch replaced by curiosity, a wary glance replaced by trust. Each milestone was celebrated quietly but meaningfully, a testament to the deep bond that could grow between humans and animals when approached with care. John also realized that his work had effects beyond the ranch itself. Children who visited with their schools or families often left with a new understanding of kindness. They learned that animals were sentient beings, deserving of respect and care, not simply tools or property. Volunteers came from all over, inspired by John's vision and dedication. Some stayed for a day, while others devoted months or years. They brought fresh energy, new ideas, and additional hands to help care for the growing number of animals. Through these interactions, John witnessed a ripple effect. The compassion he nurtured in animals was mirrored in people, creating a network of empathy and understanding that extended far beyond the ranch. The greatest lesson John learned during this period was the meaning of true freedom. At first, he had thought that rescuing animals and keeping them safe was enough. But over time, he understood that freedom was not just about physical space. It was about trust, choice, and dignity. A horse running in an open pasture was free, but even more so when it approached John voluntarily, seeking companionship without fear. A pig exploring a wide enclosure was free, but truly free when it could make decisions about where to eat, sleep, or play. Freedom was a gift that had to be nurtured patiently, and John devoted himself to creating an environment where animals could express their natural behaviors, feel safe, and gradually regain confidence that had been lost. The process of releasing animals back into the wild became one of John's most profound experiences. Some horses, once healed and strong, were guided to open plains where they could roam freely among other wild herds. Watching them disappear into the horizon, John felt a mix of joy and sadness. He had nurtured them, loved them, and cared for them, yet letting go was a necessary part of their journey. It was a reminder that true compassion was selfless, and sometimes the greatest act of love was to set someone free. Each successful release reinforced John's belief that the purpose of his work was not ownership, control, or recognition, but the restoration of life and spirit. There were also lessons in humility. Not every attempt at rehabilitation succeeded. Some animals were too traumatized to recover fully, others too sick to survive despite John's best efforts. Each loss was heartbreaking, yet each taught him something valuable. John learned to accept limitations, both his own and those of the animals. He learned that love sometimes meant acknowledging when you could not change an outcome, and that compassion was not measured by success alone, but by the effort, care, and intent behind every action. These lessons shaped John into a wiser, more empathetic individual, capable of guiding others with understanding and patience. The impact of John's work extended into the wider community as well. People who had once doubted him began to see the value of his approach. Local ranchers and townspeople, curious at first, started to appreciate the importance of compassion alongside tradition. Some began adopting small practices inspired by John, allowing animals more space, providing better care, or volunteering at his ranch. The community slowly shifted, realizing that kindness and practicality could coexist. John's efforts had created not just a sanctuary for animals, but a culture of care that touched the lives of people as well. John also learned to trust in collaboration. He could not accomplish everything alone, and the volunteers and supporters who joined him were essential to the sanctuary's growth. Together, they organized medical care, built new enclosures, repaired barns, and created enrichment activities for the animals. Each person brought their own experiences, skills, and energy, and John welcomed their contributions with gratitude. He understood that a mission of this scale required teamwork, humility, and an openness to learning from others. It was another reminder that freedom and care were not solitary endeavors. They thrived in community, with many hearts working toward a common goal. During this time, John witnessed incredible transformations among the animals. Horses that had once flinched at every movement now ran confidently across the fields. Goats that had been fearful and isolated now played together, climbing, jumping, and exploring safely. Pigs, once timid and withdrawn, became curious and interactive, forming bonds with both humans and other animals. Birds that had been injured learned to fly again, soaring through the skies with strength and grace. Each success story reinforced the meaning of his mission, proving that patience, consistency, and genuine care could heal even the deepest wounds. John's philosophy became clearer with each passing year. "I didn't buy them to own them, but to set them free," he would say, not as a slogan, but as a principle that guided every decision. Ownership, he realized, was not a measure of success. True accomplishment lay in helping others regain dignity, independence, and choice. His sanctuary was not a place of possession, but a place of liberation, a home where life could flourish, where trust could grow, and where freedom could be nurtured carefully and deliberately. The sanctuary also became a place of inspiration. Visitors often left with a renewed sense of purpose, carrying the lessons of patience, empathy, and responsibility into their own lives. Children, in particular, were deeply affected. They learned that strength was not in dominance, but in care. That courage was not in control, but in understanding. And that freedom was one of the most precious gifts one could offer. John's work had become a living lesson in ethics, compassion, and humanity, showing that even small actions could create profound change. Yet, despite all the successes, John remained humble. He understood that every day brought new challenges, and that care for living beings was never complete. Each animal had unique needs, and every day required vigilance, attention, and patience. He learned to appreciate the quiet moments as much as the dramatic successes: a horse resting peacefully, a goat exploring safely, a bird soaring in the sky. These small glimpses of contentment reminded him why he had started this journey, why he continued despite difficulties, and why the mission was worth every effort. By this stage of his life, John's sanctuary was widely recognized as a model for compassionate animal care. Other ranchers, animal lovers, and educators came to learn from his methods. John shared openly, believing that knowledge should be used to spread kindness rather than gain fame or profit. He taught visitors how to observe animals, understand their behavior, and provide environments that allowed for freedom and growth. His story, though rooted in a small town, resonated far beyond it, showing that even one person's dedication could create ripples of positive change. Through it all, John discovered something profound. The act of setting others free, whether animals or people, was transformative. It required patience, empathy, and sacrifice, but it also brought deep fulfillment. He saw that freedom, care, and trust were intertwined, and that helping someone regain autonomy was one of the most meaningful contributions one could make in life. The sanctuary was not just a place of rescue, it was a school of life, teaching lessons in compassion, resilience, and the quiet power of selfless action. By the end of these years, John had truly grown, not only as a rancher but as a human being. He had faced storms, human resistance, financial pressures, and emotional heartbreak, and yet he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more committed than ever. The ranch had become more than a sanctuary. It had become a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of patience, and a reminder that freedom, once nurtured, could flourish in ways that changed lives forever. Every animal that thrived, every volunteer inspired, and every visitor touched was a reflection of John's unwavering dedication and his belief in the value of compassion. John Miller's story in these years proved that true growth comes not only from success, but also from struggle, reflection, and the willingness to learn from every experience. His work showed that freedom, dignity, and trust are gifts that must be carefully cultivated, and that even the smallest acts of care can ripple outward, touching countless lives. The ranch was no longer just a piece of land. It was a living testament to the power of empathy, patience, and unwavering dedication to a cause greater than oneself. And as John looked across his sanctuary, watching animals move freely, explore boldly, and interact peacefully, he understood the depth of the transformation he had achieved, not just in the creatures he rescued, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who had been touched by his work. As the years passed, John Miller's ranch had transformed from a modest family property into a thriving sanctuary, a place of hope, healing, and freedom. The animals he had rescued were no longer the fragile, frightened creatures that first arrived. They were healthy, confident, and thriving. Horses ran gracefully across wide pastures, goats played and explored with joy, pigs roamed curiously, and birds soared freely into the skies. Every corner of the ranch reflected John's dedication, patience, and unwavering belief that freedom, love, and care were the most important gifts he could offer. John often reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From a boy watching wild horses run across the hills to a man managing a complex sanctuary, he had grown in ways he had never anticipated. The work had not been easy. Storms had damaged fences, injuries and illness had challenged his skills, and financial pressures often threatened to halt progress. Critics questioned his methods, neighbors doubted his purpose, and there were countless days when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. Yet through every challenge, John had persisted, guided by a simple principle: I didn't buy them to own them, but to set them free. This principle had shaped every decision, every effort, and every sacrifice he had made along the way. The sanctuary had also become a hub of inspiration for the community. People from near and far came to visit, volunteer, and learn from John's methods. Some were ranchers curious about humane animal care. Others were children and young adults seeking to understand how compassion and responsibility could coexist. John welcomed them all, eager to share not only practical knowledge, but also the lessons he had learned through years of dedication. He taught that freedom was not simply a matter of space, but of trust, dignity, and patience. Visitors left with more than admiration. They carried with them a deeper understanding of empathy and the importance of standing up for those who could not speak for themselves. One of the most rewarding aspects of John's work was seeing volunteers and community members grow alongside the animals. Many people who first came to help out of curiosity ended up dedicating significant time and effort to the sanctuary. They learned how to observe behavior, provide appropriate care, and respond gently to fear and trauma. Young volunteers, in particular, were profoundly affected. They discovered that patience and kindness could transform lives, and many carried these lessons into their families, schools, and communities. Through this ripple effect, John's mission extended far beyond the ranch itself, influencing the hearts and actions of countless people. John also began to focus more on the long-term sustainability of the sanctuary. He realized that creating a lasting impact required planning, organization, and collaboration. He developed programs for training volunteers, established connections with veterinarians and animal welfare experts, and created systems for medical care, nutrition, and habitat maintenance. He even started working with other sanctuaries to share knowledge and resources, ensuring that more animals in need could receive care and protection. John's vision had grown beyond his own property, extending into a network of support for animals and people committed to compassionate action. The personal growth John experienced during these years was profound. He had learned resilience, leadership, and the value of community. But perhaps most importantly, he had learned humility. Despite all his efforts, he understood that not every challenge could be overcome, not every life could be saved, and not every outcome would be perfect. Each loss, each setback, reminded him of the fragile nature of life and the importance of gratitude, empathy, and perseverance. These lessons, though hard-earned, made him a wiser and more compassionate person, capable of guiding both animals and humans with understanding and care. John's philosophy, buying animals not to own them but to set them free, continued to guide his every action. He understood that true freedom required more than physical space. It required emotional security, trust, and opportunities to express natural behaviors. Some animals could eventually return to the wild, while others needed the sanctuary as a permanent home. In every case, John focused on creating conditions that allowed them to live fully, freely, and confidently. He had learned that ownership without understanding or care was meaningless, and that the real reward came from seeing lives restored and spirits renewed. Over time, John's sanctuary became a model for humane animal care, recognized both locally and beyond. Other ranchers, educators, and animal welfare advocates visited to learn from his methods. John shared openly, believing that knowledge should be used to create positive change rather than for personal gain. He offered advice, demonstrated best practices, and encouraged others to adopt approaches that prioritize the well-being of animals. His story, once considered unconventional in a small rural town, became an example of what could be achieved through determination, compassion, and a commitment to doing what is right. One of John's proudest moments came when a group of rescued horses was successfully returned to a protected wild area. Watching them disappear over the horizon, running freely as nature intended, filled John with a profound sense of fulfillment. He had nurtured them from fragility to strength, guided them from fear to trust, and finally released them into the life they were meant to live. These moments, though sometimes bittersweet, were the ultimate validation of his mission. They reminded him that true compassion often requires letting go, trusting in the resilience of those we help, and celebrating their growth even when it means saying goodbye. John also saw the impact of his work in subtle, everyday ways. Animals that had once been terrified now approached humans with curiosity and trust. Volunteers who had begun hesitant and unsure grew confident, skilled, and deeply empathetic. Visitors left the ranch inspired to act with kindness in their own lives. The ripple effect of John's dedication extended far beyond the fences of his property, touching countless hearts and creating a culture of care that he could never have achieved alone. Even as he aged, John remained committed to the sanctuary. He knew that his work was not about recognition or legacy, but about service, responsibility, and compassion. Every day brought new challenges, new animals in need, and new opportunities to learn and grow. And yet the rewards, the moments of trust, the signs of recovery, the joy of seeing animals flourish, were immeasurable. They reinforced the truth he had learned long ago, that the most meaningful achievements in life are measured not by wealth or status, but by the lives we touch and the freedom we help create. John's story ultimately became one of legacy, not in the sense of fame or accolades, but in the lives he had changed and the principles he had upheld. His ranch continued to operate as a sanctuary, staffed by volunteers and supported by a community that had come to appreciate the value of compassion. Young ranchers learned from him, carrying forward practices that honored the dignity and well-being of animals. Visitors left inspired, carrying lessons of patience, empathy, and courage into their own communities. John's mission had become bigger than himself, a movement of care and freedom that would endure long after he was gone. Reflecting on his journey, John understood that the challenges he had faced, the storms, financial difficulties, skepticism, and loss, had shaped him into the person he had become. They had taught him resilience, humility, and the importance of unwavering commitment. They had shown him that true compassion requires both heart and action, that patience is essential for healing, and that freedom is the highest gift we can offer to those who cannot speak for themselves. Each obstacle had strengthened his resolve, each setback had deepened his empathy, and each success had reminded him of the extraordinary potential for kindness in the world. In the quiet moments, when the sun set over the rolling hills and the animals settled peacefully in their pastures, John often paused to reflect on the lives around him. He thought about the frightened horse that had learned to trust, the abandoned goat that had discovered joy, the injured bird that had taken flight again. Each life represented not only the resilience of the animal, but also the dedication, patience, and love that had guided it. John realized that his sanctuary was not just a place of rescue, but a living testament to the transformative power of compassion and freedom. John Miller's life, shaped by a simple yet profound belief, left a legacy that extended far beyond the boundaries of his ranch. He had shown that one person, guided by empathy, patience, and courage, could make a tangible difference in the world. He had proven that freedom is a gift worth fighting for, that care can heal even the deepest wounds, and that love, expressed through action rather than words, is one of the most powerful forces in life. His story served as a beacon of hope, inspiring others to act with kindness, to see beyond themselves, and to believe in the possibility of positive change, no matter how daunting the challenge. As John looked across his sanctuary, watching the animals move, play, and rest freely, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had dedicated his life to something greater than himself, faced every challenge with courage, and remained true to his guiding principle. The ranch was more than land, buildings, or animals. It was a symbol of hope, freedom, and the enduring impact of compassion. And in that moment, John knew that his journey, filled with trials, triumphs, and lessons, had achieved what he had always hoped for: a world where those who could not speak for themselves could live with dignity, safety, and freedom, and where kindness could ripple outward, touching hearts far beyond his own.